It's a beautiful day in downtown Tokyo, and this is Speaking of Shakespeare, a series of conversations about all things Shakespearean, with a focus on the digital technologies in teaching and research, and also about developments in Shakespeare performance and education across the globe. I'm Thomas Dabbs, recording this introduction from Aoyama Gakuin University in central Tokyo. The following conversation is with Eric Johnson, Director of Digital Access at the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C. Eric and I spoke on the evening of October 5th in the U.S. and the morning of October 6th, Tokyo time. We will be conversing from remote locations in the Washington, D.C. and Tokyo metropolitan areas. In the fall of 2018, Aoyama Gakuin University entered into a relationship with the Folger to display several editions from Aoyama Gakuin's special collections in open access formats on the Folger's new Miranda platform. This project has been funded by a generous grant from the Aoyama Vision Initiative. This series is also funded by a generous grant from the Japan Society for the Promotion of Science, called Kakenhi. And this organization thankfully includes support for research in the humanities. Okay, so let's get on with it. Thank you. Hi, Eric. How are you?
Good. How are you, Tom? Good to see you again.
Considering everything this year, doing pretty well. We're doing pretty well in Japan. I had some questions for you right off the bat, but you've already been introduced. I want to emphasize the fact that I'm working as a professor of Shakespeare at Aoyama Gakuin University in Tokyo, and you contacted me in 2018, and I remember when I was in New Orleans at the Renaissance Society of America conference, and at that time you were in the middle of, or beginning, or I'm not sure exactly where, but involved with a global initiative outreach from the Folger. And if you could explain a little bit about that, what the Folger's goals are, particularly digitally, for global outreach.
Sure. So the Folger has a mandate as part of its mission to promote the knowledge of Shakespeare around the world. It has always seen itself as primarily an American institution, of course, but as you well know, the Folger hosts researchers and other visitors from around the world. And so the Folger has been attempting to have as many people as possible enjoy Shakespeare, understand Shakespeare, and the digital resources, which I head, have, of course, a global reach by their very nature. So it's been a priority for the Folger for a decent amount of time now.
Yeah, well, there's so much happening. You know, you're in Washington, D.C., and there's so much happening in that metropolitan area. There's so many universities, there are others, libraries, and of course, art galleries with world-class collections and so forth. So you get a lot of activity from the region, but also from, within the states, and of course, Canada, North America, scholars come in. And I think for some years now, scholars in Japan have been going to the Folger to do research, but not really in droves. And I'm really happy that we've sort of re-energized, I think, not just at my university, but around my university. I have, over the years now, I've been in Japan long enough now to have cultivated very long relationships with my Japanese colleagues. And I hope we get a chance. We won't now because of the pandemic. I was hoping, of course, this month, this is October 2020, I was hoping that you could come over and we could bring you over and have you meet everyone, not just at my university, but also, involved in Shakespeare studies around Japan, in particular, several people who would be delighted to talk with you. But it didn't happen this year. Maybe, I hope next year. I hope we can get something going next year.
Hopefully so. Yeah, I'd be more than happy to do that. It really does underscore how Shakespeare is a global phenomenon. There were a few people when I mentioned that I was going to Japan for a conference and to visit your university. They're kind of surprised and wondered what my job at the Folger Shakespeare Library had to do with Japan. And then I explained that Shakespeare has actually been read and performed in Japan for quite a long time, longer than any other place outside of any non-Western culture, I believe. And that it's seen as a mark, understanding Shakespeare is seen as a mark of being cultured as it is in other places. And it also has some connections with one of the products that the Folger has, which my team supervises, which is the World Shakespeare Bibliography. And Japan has always been very prominently featured as a country where we collect bibliographic information about Shakespeare-related materials, certainly including books and articles, but including manga comic books and other popular cultural items. They're all recorded in World Shakespeare Bibliography as well. So yeah, there are multiple connections that might not be as visible to or obvious to the untrained eye.
Well, yeah, and also the rare books. Now, of course, we are working on a 15th century Bible, and of course, the Folger focuses on Shakespearean, but also on things that are early modern, and has again a world-class collection of religious text and other culturally related text. And so we are going to share that particular book and maybe a couple of others if things keep going on your new Miranda platform. And what I would like to get from you is a little bit of an update of how, of course, you guys were closed down, having nothing to do with the pandemic. You were closed for renovations,
right?
But you could still work remotely or on site. So what's the status now? Are you able to move ahead with your digital initiatives remotely or on site?
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. Why don't I give the folks who are watching this an overview of the library itself, in case they're not familiar with it, and then it'll be a long way of answering your questions, because I think then
take as much time as you need. Yes.
Okay, sure thing. But yeah, we'll end up back there. So the Folger Shakespeare Library was founded by Henry and Emily Folger. They were of some means, not fabulously wealthy, but of some means. And Henry Folger was actually a confidant and right-hand man of John D. Rockefeller. And so the Folgers did not have children, were not able to have children. So they collected Shakespeare materials as their life's work. And during the decades that they collected, they amassed the greatest collection of Shakespeare books in the entire world, including 82 first folios, which, of course, as you know, is the first collected editions of Shakespeare's works, and without which we wouldn't have half of the extant Shakespeare plays. At least over 200 single play quarto editions, which are kind of like paperback editions of single plays. And all in all, we have over 250,000 books. 20,000 of them are rare books, and tens of thousands of manuscripts and many other types of materials. The Folger is located in Washington, D.C., across from the Supreme Court and the Library of Congress on Capitol Hill. And we are more than just a library, although we certainly still are a library, very much a library. We're also a center for the arts with a professional theater and a lot of other public offerings. We have public exhibitions, a wide range of digital initiatives, and publications, which are quite popular. We have books which are used in classrooms and by Shakespeare enthusiasts, and an academic journal. As you say, we are currently closed because we are undergoing a renovation of the historic main building, and we are expected to reopen in 2022, although we do still reach millions of people through our digital offerings. So the reason we were closed, coincidentally, was for not because of the pandemic, but because of the renovations. We closed in January of this year, and then the pandemic, of course, emerged almost simultaneously with that. And the Folger would have been closed to the public anyway in the middle of March. Um, it has had an effect on our public offerings because we had expected to have public events in other places around Washington, but since most places in Washington, most public venues are closed, we've not been able to do that.
Yeah.
But yes, we are currently closed, but we are still expecting that we'll open our doors again in 2022 with renewed exhibition spaces and more things that we can offer to the public.
So the renovation, the progress then has been, well, the renovation has been progressing.
We had groundbreaking delayed for some period of time, but yes, the groundbreaking has already happened, and so we are officially in the active building phase.
Oh, good. That's good to hear that that wasn't halted or suspended for some reason. Now, are you able to work on site now? Are you guys working on site at all, or are you working remotely?
So we have the term of art, of course, is essential workers. Our essential workers have been working on site for a long time. The teams that do not need to be physically at the Folger are not at the Folger. My team, which heads up digital media and publications, there's no real reason for us to be on site at the moment, so we are not there. And so we had hoped, we collectively, the Folger had hoped, that we would be able to work on site during construction, although obviously there would be some periods where there would be disruptions. But we were thinking we will just move people off site when they need to move off site. But now the thinking is more how we will only bring in the people who actually need to be physically at the Folger. And so for the like I say, for the teams like ours where we've been able to work off site for a long time, we don't need to go in there, which is probably for the best, at least during the renovations, because and especially around the precautions that we have to take for health reasons.
Yes, well, I kind of have become a little bit obsessed, sort of looking at websites and so forth. They are worldometer website. I'm not sure how accurate you can be from country to country. Of course, people have to, sometimes, for instance, in Spain, and you know that I have an interest in visiting Spain and so forth. And there will be no recorded cases of corona, as they would call it. And then 2 days later, it just jumps up. So you know that it's been stacking up over 2 days or whatnot. But anyway, having looked at those, it seems that the Washington, D.C. area has been doing fairly well in comparison with other locations, but particularly in the States. So that's good news.
Yeah, no, it definitely is good news. It's also difficult to tell because a lot of the statistics depend on who is getting tested, how many people are getting tested. Washington tends to be an anomaly for many different reasons. The Washington, D.C. region ends up being an anomaly and not really comparable in a lot of different ways. Partly because, again, since you've spent some time around here and you understand how the American system of government goes, Washington is its own entity, neither state nor anything else. It is its own district, and then we have D.C. and Maryland, and then underneath the states of D.C. and Maryland, you've got all the different local jurisdictions. So they've all got public health authorities, and they all report statistics in a fairly uniform way, but they do have a lot of different methods and programs. So where I live in Fairfax County, we're right outside of Washington, D.C. We're in Virginia. We have different programs than would be in the district, than would be in Montgomery County across the Potomac River in Maryland. And so, yeah, it's there are a lot of things there are a lot of complicating factors when looking at this kind of thing.
Yeah, and there's a range. There's a large socio economic range in that area. The wider you draw the circle, and many different types. So many different types of, I wouldn't want to say subcultures, but just different types of people from different types of jobs and so forth. Well, that's interesting. It's interesting to me because I've been in Japan, and in Japan there hasn't been a lot of testing, and I think what happens is the old the word in Japanese is gambaru, the verb, which would mean in English to fight, but it isn't. It's just, persevering, doing so. I think that the last resort, if someone gets the sniffles, if it isn't too severe, if they get a bit of a cough, the last thing they're going to do is go into the hospital, because then they're tested and kept there. They have to, but they're required by law to stay there. So and that's probably not good public health policy. It keeps the numbers down. But on the other end, there haven't been many deaths for a population about half the size of the States. It's very low. Now, and any death, of course, is tragic, but untimely, as we say in Shakespearean language, any untimely death is tragic, but they're very low. And this is a mask-wearing culture, so it hasn't been it hasn't become a thing. And it's something that I love. I'm from the American South, so again, it's sort of odd that I'm in Japan and I'm the connection in Tokyo. But it's a love-hate sort of thing that I have. When I was in England a few years ago, I saw all of the traffic cameras, and I saw you, at some point we talked and you were complaining about the cameras going outside of DC and how they're very arbitrary and extremely strict. And a year after that, I was driving in that area and I was my address is registered in the United States. I have a post office box. So I just had this, almost sleeplessness thinking of a ticket showing up there. And I returned 6 or 8 months later, and the whole thing has expanded into, my face on telephone poles. This man is wanted. And so I had a friend go around and check the box and so forth. And I noticed in England, driving into London every 30 seconds, it seems that my navigational system, the GPS, was beeping me about cameras. And I'm thinking, there are places in the United States where some good old boys would take their shotguns out and just take care of that camera, because that's just not fair. That's not an American thing. You get to represent yourself in court, even if it's, Your Honor, I was thinking about something, I had a fight with my wife and I was thinking about that. And I went a little bit over, you get to defend yourself. And so there's that American resistance to, and it goes state to state too, a kind of resistance to central control. That you don't see as much sometimes in other countries. That in Japan, everyone is masked. Now, not everyone, about 1 out of 100 you might see, and it might be because the person dropped their mask and they're going to get one. And it has absolutely it's just considered, public health policy. We wear a mask, just like we wear a shirt to work,
But that predated the pandemic, I believe, correct?
Oh, yes. And it was something I never did, but I had colleagues every time we had faculty meetings, there'd be almost always at least one person with a mask, and the dual purpose of maybe not wanting to get sicker, but usually they feel maybe they have some sniffles in the morning, so they put on a mask so as not to. It's considered a polite thing to do, so the country is very, and also I think a lot of Asia, the Pacific Rim, in those countries is just people have been inured, or they've acclimated to the notion of it, where it was very strange for not just Americans, for friends of mine in the UK, and I had an Australian guy say something a little cross to me on the street. And I'm assuming he was Australian because I think I can differentiate the accents now, but he just thought, mate, the word mate. Nice mask, mate. He said sort of sardonically early on, but I'm sure he's masking up now too. But
I think in the States, the only time that you would wear any kind of face covering would be if you were in a dust storm, or else if you're going to rob a liquor store.
That's right. Well, years ago I worked construction. It was a summer job out in Wyoming,
That's
and
true.
there was
Yeah.
a lot of dust flying. And people on my crew, I had a bandana at that time, and I covered my face. And people on my crew got sick. There was something going because we were digging out there, and just
Mhm.
the inhalation of dust and so forth. And I didn't get sick, and I never forgot that. But and of course, it was sort of cool. You looked a little bit like a bandit. You're on a construction site. It's all a bunch of burly men. So, well, that's I'm trying to avoid in these conversations anything that won't matter a year from now, and I'm hoping that most of what we're saying now won't matter. But then again, it is the time we're living through. It's historical now. It will
Yeah.
be remembered. Are colleges back in the DC area and in secondary schools, or?
It depends. Again, it depends on the jurisdiction for the kindergarten through high school systems. So the most of the universities have, matter of fact, I think all universities that I'm aware of, although there are probably fewer out there where this isn't the case, they're either all online or more commonly there's a mix of in-person and online. I've got two kids at two different universities in Virginia, and my daughter is all online except for one of her design classes, and my son is completely online. And so there are benefits to being there, even if you're taking classes online. You can still use the library. There are other facilities that you can use. But it is pretty isolating, and I can only imagine what it must be to go to a new school at whatever level and feel like you don't know that many people. And of course, a lot of the activities have been curtailed, so that's usually how you meet people. And you're supposed to, or you meet people that you're living with, but you're supposed to keep away from other people. I think it's just it's a really tough time. My younger daughter is a first year in high school, and luckily she has peers that she knows, and she's been able to make a few friends. It helps that her older brother is the senior class president.
Oh, good.
So, as I said, you're just sort of being carried along with Christopher's slipstream, aren't you? And making your social connections. And I thought you'd get angry, but she said, "No, that's exactly what I'm doing." Um, but so she's been okay. But I can only imagine if you move from a different part of the country and you're new there, how you manage to do it. So they're going, or high school kids are going 2 days a week in person, and then 2 days a week here in our home, which I think makes a difference. I think it's good for them to get out and be in a classroom, even though they have to wear masks and they have to sit apart from the other students. But that does seem to make some kind of difference. So what is your university doing?
We're all online completely, except for special cases where in the sciences where you have laboratory work and so forth. But there is a push. We just got an email to your today, my overnight. An email came in stating policy for people who may want to give it a go. And the first thing to do is to talk with students and poll students and see how comfortable they are. It's a bit different because I would say 100%. Nobody drives to school. It's the oddest thing for an American to like me there's no parking lot out there. Everyone takes a train. And so that's more of a concern than the actual classroom, because we had a faculty meeting recently that was face-to-face, the first one this year. And so we were spaced out in a larger room, and there was no, anxiety or concern about that. And no one has gotten sick. And I don't know anyone who's gotten sick in Japan. I know several people in the States. So, but the anxiety comes with the idea, and this is kind of stronger in Japan, the idea of culpability, being held responsible. And you see this with the president right now. There's this surrounding drama of how public relations is being handled and so forth. I would say the average person, me included, but in Japan, the average fear would be the PR management that would surround any kind of super spreader event or anything, and the stigma attached to a university that said, oh, well, we've had this number of cases and so forth, and worries that students won't want to come to the university in the next year. There's much more concerned about that than actually the sickness. But so we're being extra safe. And sort of to move this into the digital world, I have not learned more about things digital in such a short period of time as in this year. And I'm no spring chicken. So, I have learned things incrementally over the years, but I had no idea how to do any of this audio visual stuff. I had to learn LMS, Learning Management System software. We're using Google Classrooms, which is worked out very well. Setting up forums, understanding how things, are how you migrate information from your database on your Google Drive into a grade book and so forth. And there's lots of people all the way through, from kindergarten all the way through, trying to do this. And I think that what I'm hoping, I'm trying to remain as positive as possible, that we're kind of seeing what might turn into a bit of a digital renaissance in the long run, with people becoming aware of the uses of digital technology. And that's what I hope, anyway.
Yeah, well, I can tell you what we've seen from the Folger's perspective. So we have an edition, again, as you know, a free edition of Shakespeare's works that are based on our Shakespeare books. So it is the texts of the plays and poems with the explanatory glosses that say what all the passages mean, taken out of them, because that's what people pay for when they're paying for the books. So the free version is just the texts. And we debuted a new version of the website, again, just coincidentally, in February. It'd been in the works for a very long time, which turned out to be very fortuitous, because we were able to catch the updraft of the, as you say, the surge in people using digital materials. At one point in April and May, 20% of our traffic was coming from learning management systems, and previous to that, that was maybe 5%, 7%.
Wow! So that's
even during our busy times, and 10% of the traffic was coming from Google Classroom alone. So that we had always known that people were using Folger, the Folger's texts as part of Shakespeare curriculum. Yes, thank you. And so we were very pleased to see that that there was more of an uptake, but it really had not been something that we had thought very deeply about in terms of that being a use case. We thought about the use case of a student reading Romeo and Juliet and wanting to look up a passage, but we hadn't really thought about of course we had thought about classroom teachers assigning Romeo and Juliet and things like that, but we hadn't really thought about classroom teachers coming up with lesson plans that specifically were linking to our texts and doing something meaningful with them, whatever it might be. Again, we were aware of the usage, and we had not really thought to differentiate it, and also to think in terms of all online learning. We had always thought in terms of when the student was accessing a text of ours, it was outside of classroom use, or they were looking it up on their phone while they were reading, had the book in their hand in the classroom. So yeah, it's really forced us to think more about how people are using these materials. Give you one other, I think, fascinating example. We did a little test that we're going to expand, where we recorded 6 of the essays that are about Macbeth on the Folger Shakespeare site, so shakespeare.folger.edu. And because we had released excerpts of the audio recordings, the full cast audio recordings of 7 of the plays, and they became very popular in classrooms and elsewhere. We could only put them all up for a limited amount of time because of the coronavirus, because of our arrangement with our publisher. But they were live for about 2.5 months in their entirety. So we decided, okay, well, we can record some of these essays about Macbeth and release them on the Folger Shakespeare site, which we did, and they've been reasonably popular. They have we've been tracking them, and they're being used by the hundreds, which on a very popular site is a small amount of traffic, but it's growing, and we didn't really expect it to be all that popular right out of the gate. However, there is one audio file, the introduction to Macbeth, which had gotten 2,500 listens or accesses in about 2 weeks, and that was considerably more than any other recording had gotten yet. So we looked at the origins of where the users were coming from in Google Analytics, which tracks which tracks all the metrics about the site usage, and we found that a school system in Raleigh-Durham, North Carolina, must have assigned students to listen to the introduction to Macbeth. Even though they could read the essay right there on the website, they still there was still a link directly to the audio recording. And so we were very pleased with this, that someone thought this was worth letting apparently hundreds of students listen to. But it also force us again to think about how our materials are being used, because they're accessing the recordings without going to the web page. They were just using the learning management system link to play the audio. So people would click on the link and just play the audio. It wouldn't be nicely surrounded by a Folger web page or anything like that. But the recording says from the Folger Shakespeare Library and says where they can find the text. So we're happy that people are using these materials, but it is going to require deeper thought on our behalf as to how they're being used in the real world now, which is significantly different than it was last year.
Well, it makes perfect sense. And I have 2 comments about that. I remember being in college and even graduate school, we did not have the video, access to videos. I think that back then, this is another century, of course, we had a lot of audio, though. And we're talking turntables with styluses and that sort of thing. And I remember my high school teacher playing King Lear on as a record, as a vinyl, as part of our class, and hearing with the text made it much more vivid, even without visuals. And I remember another case in graduate school where I had to cover all of the history plays, and I kept falling asleep trying to read them because and they run together at one point. And I went down to the basement of that library in that university, and they had those audio recordings, and I pulled the book out and listened to each history play, and it made all the difference in the world. And it also committed it to memory. So it almost was better than seeing an audio, a video production of a play, because you see that you get lost in the characters and their acting, which is wonderful. But if you're in an academic setting, that audio with the text is there's a word for it in the educational, multi-layered learning or something like that. Yeah. That's one thing. Another thing is that people who are outside of teaching are not thinking, well, suddenly we were faced with, okay, go get your text, but I'm looking down at my text and reading, and they're seeing me or I can put up a share screen and I can annotate with the Zoom, in my case, the Zoom function, but there are other LMSs, but I can highlight, I can put in comments in a little text box. And while recording, they can go back and see where those things are. So I think that's the reason that you've seen an uptick in the Folger usage, and that's fabulous. So I do want to, before we move on, we're going to move on a little bit to your life, but about Miranda, if you could and explain, you or have a better grip on what makes Miranda better. And I will say this, that we were looking for money in order to digitize our texts so we could put them on your platform, because our university is a big comprehensive university, but we just don't have the funding and the priorities to set up something that sophisticated. And so part of this is trying to show people how smaller institutions with smaller special collections can share with world-class elite institutions and attach themselves and have their it's a win-win situation for everyone. We get our text exposed and you get larger collections and so forth. But why is Miranda better than, say, the visual platforms they had 20 years ago?
Sure. Yeah, so I think I would hasten to say that what we've built in Miranda is better for the Folger. It might not be best for every institution, and the path that we have gone on is not unique, but it is not necessarily the usual path. So the usual path would be to get off-the-shelf software and adapt it to the Folger's needs. There are a couple challenges with that. The first is that the Folger is as I was describing earlier, is a multifaceted institution, and we're not just one thing. We are not just a library. We're not just a theater. We're not just a museum. We combine elements of all these different cultural institutions. So coming up with a software package that could cover all of those usages would have required a lot of customization. So we figured, why don't we just take components that are already out there in the world, weld them together into one platform, and then, here's the second challenge, adapt the data model ourselves to accommodate our collection. Because that is the challenge that most special collections libraries have. So again, as you know, I hate telling you. I feel like I'm mansplaining to you if I tell you what a special collections library is. But I feel like for the
please do, because there are things I don't know everything, and I hope we'll have plenty of listeners who.
I hope you know this is for the sake of the listeners, not because I think you don't know what I mean. So a typical university library has a wealth of options available to it for library software. A special collections library, by definition, is focused on its own unique collection. So in the Folger's case, we focus on rare books mainly from Western Europe, from the 16th to the 18th century, and also Shakespeare materials from his time to the present day. So that's a pretty narrow focus. If we were a university library, we would not have the breadth of materials that we have in those areas. So it's the specialized areas. And so we need to classify our materials much more deeply than a university library would. So even a well-stocked university library might have 300 books on Macbeth, for example. But the Folger has literally thousands of items that are related to Macbeth. And a lot of them, when you were looking at the metadata, the descriptive data about the objects, a lot of them look pretty much the same. And so we have to figure out a data model that takes into account and can differentiate between those things so people can find the material and make some use of it. That would happen whether or not we were picking off-the-shelf software or we were building it ourselves. Also, the third thing that we were trying to accomplish with Miranda is to bring in all of our digital materials into one platform. So as far as its holdings, Miranda has the hundreds of thousands of records that we have of our physical collection, and then brings together our images, video, audio files, data sets, and other things, other digital media. And it allows us to collect media from other sources. So for example, the Biblia Latina that you mentioned from AGU. And so we can add it as if it is a member, as if it is part of our collection, and people could go to Miranda and access it as they would any other types of materials. It does get to a tricky question, because we do want to indicate the origin of the material as we always would, but not misrepresent that we happen to have this copy of this book. It seems to be working well for us. Miranda is not just a repository that we put things into. It is also a way of distributing that media. So we have media players that we can embed into, say, a blog entry or a website. And so you're able to zoom into a particular image and zoom out of it. Then you can click a link and it will go over to Miranda, and you can see the full item. But you don't have to automatically go to Miranda. You can incorporate that material into other web pages. And it doesn't even need to be a Folger web page. You can do that through a WordPress blog or whatever site you have.
Yeah. Well, I've seen the metadata is very well displayed, the parts of the metadata that are important to identifying the source of the book. I think what really attracted me and also my colleagues, and particularly Japanese colleagues, because there's an old joke among me and a couple of my colleagues during a meeting. We were going over something again and again and again, a faculty meeting, and it went for a couple of hours, longer than a already long meeting. And my now retired colleague, who is a sort of distinguished scholar in Japan, he wrote me a little note in English and passed it to me. And he said, "In Japan, detail is God." And we were talking about in detail about something that was just driving everyone crazy, but it had to be worked out. But there's a love of that, and the ability for these high resolution displays through Miranda, and of course other platforms. But I think that is the big difference from before. For the just average person off the street, you can zoom in, and of course, people come to the Folger who are experts in the history of printing, and they need that level of detail to see how an E. I was invited by some faculty at Keio University to use a 19th century printer where we blotted it out with ink. And so we're a few centuries in advance, but it's still the same thing. It's a wooden press. And so we blotted the ink and we put the paper on, and we had set from their Gutenberg Bible the typeset that would imitate that, and made 10 reproductions of that one page. And then the digital guys came in and zoomed in and showed the difference between each individual sheet. And when you get very, very close, you see that. And Nagasaki Sensei Kiyonori, who's my friend and colleague, he does Buddhist studies, and they're trying to do search capabilities in ancient manuscripts that are handwritten. So any difference in a way a Chinese character is made has to be somehow put into the process of the mind of the search engine. So that is something extremely interesting. The Miranda platform and these new high definition capabilities are very important. Well, that's just fabulous, and I'm so happy to hear that you guys have continued your work there. I'm going to move on to your personal life. You're free to talk about as much about it as you want. And sure. You can even make up stories, and we can try to figure out whether or not I'm joking. But you are, everyone that I've interviewed, I interviewed Sarah Olive last week from the University of New York. And of course, she has an interesting biography, having been born in the UK, educated partially in Australia, and then going back to the UK. And in your case, I don't think you and I, judging from what our backgrounds are, there's some overlap probably in our backgrounds, the kind of families we came from. I think I was expected to be an insurance salesman, and I was a good, small town insurance salesman. I don't know what was projected for you when you were, say, 10 or 11 or 12 years old. Where was the turn? Where was the turn to Shakespeare?
So, yeah, I think probably when I was younger, I think my parents just wanted me to survive to be 18 at least. But I came to Shakespeare the way most students did with Shakespeare, and that was through school. I was in acting classes in junior high school, and we were asked to memorize Mark Antony's famous speech, the funeral oration. And I think that was the first time that I had really thought about Shakespeare as a living thing. I certainly knew who Shakespeare was, and we had been forced to read Shakespeare like other students, but every student in the class needed to deliver the speech and needed to interpret it. So we had to memorize it. So there was something about getting inside those lines that really fired my imagination and kind of kindled in me a love of Shakespeare that grew over the years. I actually came to act on the Folger stage as a teenager because I grew up outside of Washington, D.C., not too far away from where I live right now. And there was and is a Folger High School festival where high schools from around the region would come and perform either condensed, very, very condensed versions of Shakespeare plays, or would perform segments of Shakespeare, remixed Shakespeare, or whatever else. And so I was on stage with my theater class, and we performed some segments from Romeo and Juliet. So throughout schooling, I kept up with Shakespeare. I watched Shakespeare movies. And I got my master's degree in English from George Mason University in Virginia. And I was working out of college, my second job out of college. I was both going to get I was in my MA program, and I was also working for a newspaper that belonged to a larger news company. And I was running their websites, the company's websites. And since I had minored in theater, and when I was an undergraduate, I asked the arts editor of the paper if I could review play productions. And she said, "Well, we can't pay you any extra." I said, "But I'll get in for free, right?" And she said, "Yes." And so I decided, okay, well, that's a fair trade. So for whatever reason, the editor kept assigning me to local Shakespeare productions. And a lot of folks outside of DC area don't know this, but there is the Shakespeare Theater and the Folger Theater, and they both perform a lot of Shakespeare. So and other companies in the DC area perform Shakespeare with some regularity. So there was and is a lot of Shakespeare around for me to review, and I reviewed plays at the Folger, among other places, for the paper. And so this is one of the little turning points in life that you don't really realize is going to be a turning point. As I was writing my reviews, I wanted to get accurate quotations from the plays, and I had a complete works of Shakespeare, so the G.B. Harrison edition that was used in colleges for decades. And but if I didn't know exactly where it was in the play, I would go to a Shakespeare website and try to find the passage. And I learned that I did not particularly like the Shakespeare websites that were out there. And here I was, as a career, building websites. And I thought, you know what? I bet I could do better. But I actually started at one point to build a Shakespeare text site. But then I laid it aside because I realized it was going to be a decent amount of work.
Yeah.
But I always thought, somebody could do this better. So then another interesting thread of my life comes into the story, I guess. So starting when I was 18, I was in the Marine Corps Reserve, and I served in the Marine Reserve for 13 years. So I was part-time in the Marines throughout college, and then while I was pursuing my civilian career that I was just describing, and was called up for active duty for the Iraq War in early 2003. At that point, I still had not finished my master's in English when I was activated, and I still needed a thesis project. So I'd finished all my requirements, but I needed to have either a writing or editing thesis project. And after after several months, our Marine unit was redeployed from Iraq to Kuwait, and we were there for an extended period of time, not doing a whole lot, just sitting in tents in the middle of the summer. And so there's only so many movies that you can watch on laptops. So I decided I really needed to do something productive. So as it happened, I had a laptop that I carried throughout the Iraq. It was my personal laptop. Actually, it was for my job at the time. And I had access to a shaky connection to the internet. And so I downloaded the software and several Shakespeare texts. And I decided I'll just start on a Shakespeare site. And hopefully when I go back, George Mason will accept this site as an editing project that I can use to finish my MA. And by the time I left Kuwait to come home, the basic site that became open source Shakespeare was finished. And I continued to work on it and convinced the English department at George Mason that this should be my thesis project. And I brought in all of the plays eventually. First I thought it was just going to be, I'll take 5 plays and I'll develop something, but it really caught my imagination. I did far more than I really needed to do. And also I wrote a companion paper, which I was told by my advisors should be about 15 to 20 pages. And then they kept giving me suggestions and ended up with the appendices being about 83 pages or so. You know how those things go. And also, to bring in one of the last remaining threads, in 2004, I thought, okay, well, Folger Shakespeare Library is right there. I wonder what they would say about my site. So I emailed them, told them about the site, which had been out for a few months. I said, "Do you have any advice? I'd love to drop by and talk to you all." And I talked to Jim Kuhn, who at the time was in charge of the computer systems at the Folger, the library computer systems, and Georgiana Ziegler, who was the head of reference and who has helped thousands of Shakespeareans and early modernists over the years find the materials in the depths of the Folger that they needed to access. And they gave me some fantastic advice. Probably the best advice was, they said, build a concordance, because there used to be a Shakespeare concordance with every word that Shakespeare ever wrote, or at least in this edition. But it belonged to a professor who had passed away, and the university, in their wisdom, pulled the website that the professor had created, because it was on his personal website and he was dead. So naturally, you would shut down a resource that lots of people use. And I said, well, are you sure? Do people even use concordances anymore? And they said, if you build a concordance, lots of people will come to your website. And I said, well, okay, that's fine. So at this point, I was working just in the evenings as I could. And so after about a week of work in the evenings, a little bit on the weekend, the concordance was done. And I released it and told people on the Shakespeare listserv that's been around for a zillion years, announced it. And that was really the first time that open source Shakespeare became known to the Shakespeare community. And it slowly built up its reputation over the years. And it's gotten quite popular. There's about 2 million people a year who use OSS.
Wow.
So yeah,
Wow.
it is very gratifying. Because I first started attending the Shakespeare Association of America conferences in 2008, and as I would talk to people, I'd tell them about my interesting little sites, and some people had said, "Well, actually, I've already seen it," which was very nice. But there was some point after a few years, where I would start to tell people about the site, and sometimes it would get a little bit miffed that I would imply that they hadn't heard of the site, and it had just become part of, as far as they were concerned, the infrastructure of of Shakespeare world. Not the only place where you could get the text, certainly, but a place where you could do some great searching, and like I say, the concordance, and then features like being able to click on a character's name and seeing all the characters' lines. Those are all things that, as far as I knew at the time, were not available to the rest of the world. And I guess the last thing I would say about it, I really wanted it to be free, because I figured that the texts themselves were free, and so I wanted to make access available to the widest possible number. And that's one of the things that I've enjoyed doing at the Folger, is that even though, of course, we have products that we have to charge for, we are bringing Shakespeare to a vast audience, and as much as we're possible, lowering the costs or making it freely available.
Yeah, well, this was a story. Yeah, I ran across open source Shakespeare before I knew you, and I received a grant. I think it was 2014, and I decided to take a trip to the Folger and meet you. And I said, well, this guy, the guy who did open source Shakespeare, and he's at the Folger, he's probably going to tell me, listen, look, I don't have much time for you. And you were, of course, very, very open, and invited me in, and we talked in your office and so forth. But I was like, wow, I'm meeting, I felt like I was, what is it, the old Wayne's World movie, and I'm not worthy. I was getting a backstage pass to open source because I used it, and so many of my students had used it, for graduate students in particular, had used it. It was so helpful to, because as we know, you have a universe of textual variants. But if you're trying to write a paper, let's say you find a key word in there. I've seen a paper recently where they were looking at the word rank, which means quite a lot of things, anything from smelling badly to being of high rank, and how it's used in Shakespeare. And you can start with open source Shakespeare, and then you can work your way out to variants and say the three major early versions of Hamlet. But it is a fabulous place to see if you're on the right track, if you're doing really deep research. And also, it's just fun to kind of play with, to see how often Shakespeare, how often a word is used and the way in which it is used. It's just, I've kind of gotten those, how you go on these little YouTube journeys, sometimes little rabbit holes. And that's happened to me on open source, where I realized, a half an hour, 45 minutes have gone by, and I've just been kind of doing that.
No, that's great. It's always great to hear people say that. And I do the same thing too. I mean, I'm a Shakespeare enthusiast myself. But yeah, there's a number of times when I'll look and see where Shakespeare used particular words, or I'll try to look up a quotation that's appropriate for a particular, to head a paper or something like that, or to make a point. But I also think it's interesting to see it's both interesting to see words that you wouldn't think Shakespeare would have used, but also words that there are a number of words that Shakespeare didn't use at all, but you would have thought that he had. And so the silences can see a lot too. Or even some really unexpected things, like Shakespeare actually used the word unfriended twice.
Unfriendly?
Unfriended.
Oh, unfriended. Unfriended.
Yes, not
there's a whole, I could see a whole critical article there. That's, yeah.
Yeah. So he did not use it as a verb.
Yeah.
He used it as an adjective. So someone without friends. But I still think it's fascinating that even that as friending has become a common verb today.
Yeah.
Mostly because of Facebook, I guess. But it is funny that to see words like that cropping up in in Shakespeare as well.
Well, and you can expand from there too. You can find out what other words people were using beyond Shakespeare, and it gives you a couple. Well, buzz is one that I found. The buzz I always would associate with the internet. What's buzzing, the sites and so forth from the early Yahoo days on out. But buzz was frequently used as a word for gossip and for
Yeah.
what's on the buzz, because of the sounds within chambers where people would sound like a murmur or a buzz, particularly St. Paul's Cathedral in central London. That word is used. Well, I do want to emphasize too that this is a I have a patriotic bent, that we have someone deployed as a U.S. Marine, and of course the old story is 95% just complete boredom and then 5% terror, right? But taking that extra time in deployment and moving forward Shakespeare studies. And of course, there are many stories like that. Well, I'll just bring up one. After the Fukushima disaster in Japan in 2011, there was a lot of not knowing, and there were some Marines deployed off the coast of Japan on a ship. And I don't know the details. I can send you a copy of the book that this is recorded in, but these people needed food. Very early on. And you didn't know what the extent of the fallout was. So these guys went into harm's way. They had no idea. They could have been going into a very hot zone and helped with a lot with cleanup, with getting food out there, with making sure that people were in safe places and getting clean water in there. And that's another thing that the U.S. Marine Corps did. So I'm sort of giving a plug there for our troops, because sometimes we only, and maybe Hollywood is responsible too a little bit, you only see some of the things that are not so positive.
Yeah, no, I'd love to hear more about that. There's so many there's so many Marine assets in the region, especially in Okinawa, where the 3rd Marine Division is located. But no, that is great to hear.
Well, yeah, the stories where someone behaves badly are more newsworthy than the many stories of what happens, and that's the U.S. Navy too, internationally, where certain aid efforts are done. So I wanted to bring that up. I'm feeling probably a little bit, what the Japanese word is not skashi, is homesickness. And I don't typically feel that way, but I'm not in a position now, unless I have a very good excuse, to be able to return to the States and then return back to Japan and be perfectly assured that I can resume my work duties and so forth. I could be held up, no telling where, really. And that's one of the sad things. That's great. And everyone in your family, it sounds like, well, your kids aren't in secondary school, at least. You're not having to do homeschooling. And
no, well, they are. So the younger two are doing, like I say, school halftime at home.
They're high schoolers. Are they high? Yeah. Okay. So
Yeah,
they're kind of independent.
Yeah. Although so half the class is at home, half the class is in. So if there's a classroom of 20, 10 of them say will be at home that day, and then 10 of them will be in the classroom. So half of the student body is doing online learning, and then half of the student body is present at the school. But no, they actually, today both of them were home, and they were just in their rooms. I was sitting at my desk and being productive, and I heard them go to lunch in the kitchen, and they went right back to their right back there. But no, there's actually, since the teacher is instructing like a normal school day, they're just there on video. The students are just there, including my kids, are there on video. So yeah, it's not, it's a little bit depersonalized, but it's not luckily my wife and I don't need to do too much intervention with our kids.
Yeah, yeah. I'm thinking about people with 5-year-olds or 7-year-olds and so forth.
Oh,
And
God
we've
bless
been
them.
there.
No, it's I mean, and it is funny. You know, my younger daughter was saying, you know, isn't it funny that all these experts are saying, you know, limit your screen time with your kids and saying, you
Mhm.
know, an hour at most, and then make them do things off their screens. But, but they're saying, you know, plop your kids in front of a screen for 6 or 7 hours a day, and we'll call that schooling.
We call it,
Uh,
yeah. Yeah. Well, let's just hope that things do settle down here a bit. And, I, I just could not, when I started teaching, our academic year in Japan starts in April, which is very strange. It's nothing like the rest of the world, but we started in April. So, for instance, when I was talking with Sarah Olive, they're kind of just starting with online learning because they went into summer break,
right.
and we didn't. We taught all the way through, and we started late, so we taught into August, and then started the next term almost immediately. And when I first started the online, I said, "Okay, guys, well, I'm sorry I don't get to meet you face to face now, but I'll get to do this in the fall." I said that with great confidence. So now I'm finished with my prognostications and looking into the future. But at some point, things have to get better. I think in Shakespeare, it was 2-year lockdown of the theaters in the '90s. I may be wrong about that, but and we look back and go, that's not 2 years, and that's locked down from a plague that killed you. That
Yeah.
just, I mean, killed. They're just dead people in the streets, people just falling over dead in the streets, and
Yeah.
mass, just horrible, most horrible kind of things. So I guess we're left with the image of, say, Romeo and Juliet. I always thought the image of the monk carrying the letter, the lower friar actually carrying the letter to Romeo that never got to Romeo, or else we would have had a happy ending. Um, he's locked up in a plague house. And it always seemed to be sort of a ridiculous, contrived thing for me. And now it doesn't.
Yeah.
You know, we can
Yeah.
see
No,
it.
it's
The plague was just before that play came out, and the theaters were just opened. And that's bad enough. But the good thing is that the memory of the theaters did reopen. Life returned to normal. It did end, and so that's what we can hope for. Okay. Well, if I could ask you, we're going to finish up right now, but if I could ask you, Eric, to stay for maybe 1 or 2 minutes after we finish recording, and I have one quick question for you, and then I'll let you get back with your life. And
yeah, sure, absolutely.
thank you
Well,
so much for coming on. This was just wonderful, and it's good that we can do this. As imperfect as things are, that at least we can do this. And
yes, I'm very happy to do this, and thank you to anyone who is watching and listening to us. I hope that we're of interest, and I appreciate your attention.
okay.